Hello, everyone. Welcome. See a lot of familiar faces. Welcome. Glad to see you here today.
Hello.
Hello. We're going to get started in just a second as people are popping in. Hey, Elaine, thanks for joining us from Campus Compact.
Hello.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are so pleased to have you here today, and especially for another esteemed guest. We are just thrilled to welcome Dr. Mitchell here today. But before we get started, I just want to make a few comments. I know some of our folks here today are new, and just to give you a little bit of the background of our Civic Dialogue series. My name is Patty Robinson, and I am the Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons. And I'm joined by my colleagues Jan Connell and Kimberly Rosenfeld. Jan from 3CSN and Cerritos College, and Kimberly from Cerritos College. And then also we have Rebecca Moonstone. There she is. I was looking for her from 3CSN. So she is assisting us with a lot of our, or I should say all of our tech issues. So thank you, Rebecca. So I know that some of you are here for the first time. Some of you have been here before and you know how this is organized, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of the background of how this series started. We began the Civic Dialogue series in fall 2020, and it was actually out of a Bringing Theory to Practice grant that Cerritos College and College of the Canyons, Cal State Northridge, and Cal State Dominguez Hills were working on. And when COVID hit, we had hoped to have an in-person faculty development training, but when COVID hit, we had to shift gears. And so we turned this into a dialogue series whereby we were actually able to start bringing folks in from around the country and having this then produced by 3CSN. Where we are now is that we've been fortunate enough to add 2 more folks to our team, Cal State LA and Los Angeles Los Angeles City College. And we are now working on the Way Forward grant, also from Bringing Theory to Practice. And so as we have put this series together, we have tried to bring together researchers, scholars, and practitioners that are working in the field of civic engagement, democratic engagement, to bring different issues to the forefront of what we're doing in higher education, and particularly with regard to community colleges. And so what we have in store today is Dr. Mitchell's presentation, and then we will have it's followed at 12 by an hour-length deep dive in which Kimberly, Jan, and I will facilitate. And so any of you who would like to stay on, please do. And then just the guiding framework for today, we're advancing an understanding of the intersection between equity, agency, and civic engagement to promote the public good. We're also recognizing civic, community, and democratic engagement as a high impact practice, and we're leveraging participants' current knowledge to build capacity to innovate for local and global change. And with that, it's with my great honor that I am here to introduce Dr. Tania Mitchell. And this is especially exciting for me because I go back to her very famous article from 2008 where she talks about critical service learning. And so I have long envisioned having this kind of presentation with Dr. Mitchell, so we are so pleased here. Dr. Mitchell is an associate professor of higher education at the University of Minnesota. She is an internationally recognized scholar of community engagement. Her research focuses on service learning as a critical pedagogy to explore civic identity and leadership, social justice, student learning, and development of race and racism, and community practice. She integrates practices in higher education that aim to contribute to a more just world. Her scholarship has been published in numerous books and journals, and she is the editor of 4 books, most recently, Black Women and Social Justice Education, Legacies and Lessons, which I just ordered. So I'm waiting for that Amazon truck to arrive. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Mitchell. It is with much pleasure that we introduce you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. because that will make this much less messy as we move forward. So good morning for you, almost afternoon now officially for me. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be with you today. I want to extend my gratitude to Jan and Kimberly and Rebecca and Patty for the invitation, for your organization, for your support, and for bringing us together today. These virtual experiences are starting to feel a bit easier now that we're 18 months into the pandemic, but I still wish for the opportunity to gather with you all in person. Meanwhile, I remain appreciative that we've figured out new ways to share space and time and to share thinking in the midst of the pandemic. I want to extend my gratitude to all of you for your generosity in making space to be thoughtful and planful and hopeful about community engaged praxis and civic opportunities before us. I'm grateful for the space and time to think with you about what our work is and should be now as we navigate this current socio-political context. I first started writing about my experiences and this moment in June of 2020, but as the contexts have continued to shift, so is my thinking. Because I have a tendency to ramble, I'm going to read remarks today, but I hope you'll be distracted from my reading by all of the images that I will share with you this morning. My hope is to share some experiences and thinking and to get us thinking together about a community engagement praxis that has had to shift and likely needs to do more shifting in order to be fully immersed in and responsive to what is happening around us. So I'll begin. On May 25th of 2020, George Floyd was murdered. I live 3 blocks from the intersection of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, where Mr. Floyd was killed. Like most of the world, I found out about his death the next morning as the video of Minneapolis police officers facilitating his restraint and ultimately his death was broadcast on the morning news. At that point in late May, I hadn't been to that intersection of 38th and Chicago since March. I hadn't been riding the bus to go to my campus office where I'm talking to you from now. The restaurant I frequent on the corner had not yet reopened since we were all sheltered in place under Governor Tim Walz's orders responsive to the coronavirus pandemic. Basically, I hadn't left my house for more than 2 months prior to that morning. It was shortly after 8 a.m. on the morning of May 26th when I first heard the news of Mr. Floyd's killing. And it was just after 11 a.m. when I heard the first helicopters. Police, military, and media helicopters would be overhead for much of the month that followed. Sirens, smoke, and cries for justice dominated our senses for weeks. But I'd like to take a couple of steps back. I'd actually like to take us back a year and a half and ask you to take a second to think about the world and your life on and before May 24th of 2020. When COVID rightly dominated the news, when all of our work was moved remotely, when travel and pretty much any plans with other people were canceled. When the death tolls continued to rise and felt like they may never slow, when people were afraid to leave their houses. Kernan has argued that, quote, racism is a pandemic inside a pandemic. And the coronavirus pandemic highlighted America's enduring racial disparities, which are fueled by decades of unequal treatment, unequal opportunity, and structural barriers. According to Greenhouse, Blacks have been infected with COVID-19 at 3 times the rate of whites, and their death rate is twice that of whites. This same information is true for the Latinx community, and the numbers are worse for many of our indigenous relatives. We still see disparate distribution patterns in the vaccine, with communities of color and those from low-income communities being under-vaccinated. The economic impacts of racism emerge through the pandemic as we see hugely disparate impacts on the finances and prospects of people of color. COVID-19 has exacerbated racial disparities and joblessness throughout the American economy, disproportionately impacting people of color, even as those same folks are more likely classified as quote unquote essential workers, particularly those in high-risk janitorial and sanitation work, as well as in the agricultural and food processing, which were significant hotspots early in the pandemic. As the eviction moratorium was ending in many places across the country, Blacks and Latinos were expected to lose their housing at much greater rate than whites. Thankfully, the American Rescue Plan extended that moratorium. Feeding America, the organization that tracks food insecurity and runs food distribution programs across the country, anticipates a rise of more than 54 million people who will experience food insecurity. That's an increase of 46% over 2019. For myriad reasons, we know that minoritized communities will have a harder time rebounding economically from the pandemic and the structural injustices of racism, everything from disproportionate rates of home ownership to less reliable medical coverage and access, from the everyday fear of police violence to the agonizing burden and grief of losing loved ones. At a time when it feels like your government believes that Black and Brown and Asian people are disposable, I believe that we are in the wake of multiple pandemics, not just COVID, but also the pandemics of economic inequality and structural racism that have had us in what Fisher and Bubla call the pandemic inequality feedback loop. I realized that my lighting in my office turned off because I'm not moving. So I was just gonna shift really quickly to get some light on again. In Christina Sharp's text, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, she uses the multiple definitions of wake as a way to analyze what she calls Black survivance. Sharp writes, wakes are processes. Through them, we think about the dead, about our relations to them. They are rituals through which we enact grief and memory. But wakes are also the disturbance in the water, the air currents behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow. And wake means being awake and also consciousness. So let's return to 38th and Chicago. The notion of wake as process, as grief and memory, as tribute and celebration, as disturbance, as awakening, as consciousness. These elements of the wake feel very real at the intersection of 38th and Chicago. It's a weird thing, one that I've never experienced before, to have your neighborhood become a major news story. It's been nearly 17 months since Mr. Floyd was killed, but the site where he died, again, just 3 blocks from my home, has been sacred space, contested space, but hallowed. I have a 4-year-old, and after George Floyd's death, driven by a desire to raise a young person aware of, but not afraid of, the realities of being a Black person in the world, of needing a space to express my outrage and my grief, and seeking the comfort of community, really for the first time, and despite COVID, I started spending time at the intersection. In the first days after his death, it was a media hotspot filled with camera crews, reporters, protesters, and mourners. And then it changed. Protests continued around the city and around the world, really. In Minneapolis, attention shifted towards downtown and the location of the Minneapolis Police Department's 3rd precinct, where the uprising that decimated the Lake Street corridor, burning down the police precinct building, but also a near 3-mile stretch of businesses, mostly restaurants and small shops, largely owned by people of color, as well as grocery stores, a Target, and several pharmacies. The initial impact of this destruction was painful, it was scary, and the arrival of the National Guard, which followed, changed the tenor of the whole moment. It was a shift from protest to confrontation. But at 38th and Chicago, the site of George Floyd's death, the space had been transformed. The pandemics of racism, of economic inequality, of COVID were already at play in the 4 neighborhoods that intersect at 38th and Chicago. And those pandemics were felt deeply before George Floyd's death, but the incident at 38th and Chicago demanded a different kind of response and a different kind of engagement. I've been trying to find another space where someone has been killed, especially through state violence, and the site of their death remains memorialized. And the only one that I can arrive at is the Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The profundity of those 2 deaths being held as sacred sites, one who led protests and was killed, and one whose killing bore protests, has stayed with me as I move through the intersection each day. It is a powerful place to be, one filled with reverence, but also a lot of tension as the community gathered during the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former officer who physically restrained Mr. Floyd with his knee on his neck, felt even more palpably and released, at least for a moment, as Chauvin was found guilty on April 20th of 2021. The tension rebuilt as city officials and some community members insisted that it was time to, quote, reopen the intersection. And on Friday, June 4th, city crews arrived at the intersection at 4:30 in the morning, giving no notice to the caretakers to remove the barricades and clear the street in order to allow traffic. People put their bodies before tow trucks and bulldozers, already undoing what had been built, put their personal property in the street to recreate the barricades just removed, reasserting this space as ours to preserve, to protect, and to protest. We are replaying traumatic events of the past and bracing ourselves still for more injury. The neighbors and the community members who see themselves as committed to a different future, a more just future for those who live in and near the 38th Street corridor, have stepped up in huge ways, seeing the place where George Floyd was murdered by the state as sacred ground, as a site of protest, as a space to create and sustain Black joy. It is important to recognize the artists, activists, and organizers who are doing the everyday labor of beautifying the intersection and maintaining the site as an autonomous zone. This is most visible through the work of Janelle Austin, the lead caretaker who works most closely with the Floyd family and art spaces throughout the city that serve to curate and preserve the memorial. Jay Webb is the gardener who designs the landscaping, leads people in planting, cares for the plants, flowers, and vegetables installed at the site. Marcia Howard, our neighbor, a teacher who took a leave of absence to dedicate herself to the protest, is also a former Marine who also keeps an active Instagram and TikTok presence and has been a visible leader to share the story of the protest. Sanctuary, sacred space. It was renamed by the people, not the city, George Floyd Square. The intersection remained completely blocked to vehicle traffic and accessible only to walkers, rollers, or bikers for a full year after his death. It is now technically open to traffic, but few cars dare to drive through the intersection. It looks different now than it did last spring because of the effort to reopen, but it is still the square. It is a sacred space. It has become an art space, a gathering place, a meditation site, a COVID testing location, a vaccination spot, a resource center distributing mutual aid, a food pantry, a lending library, a dance party. When it was cold, it was an ice skating rink, and when it was warm, a roller rink. It is a mobile medical clinic. George Floyd Square is a community organizing training ground. Public art, including murals, sculptures, benches, street art, is protected. Flowers are brought to honor, and when they have begun to wilt or have died, they are collected and composted. The gardens are planted in the middle of the street, are watered, weeded, and harvested for those who are food insecure in our neighborhood. There are caretakers who make sure that visitors are masked, who educate them about the space, introducing the art, pointing them to resources, encouraging people to honor the place and remembering what happened, to be reverent, to be encouraged, and to be inspired towards more action. Concerns about what would happen with snow removal were quickly answered when volunteers showed up with wheelbarrows and shovels to ensure that the area was kept clear. George Floyd names itself an autonomous zone. The area polices itself, mostly facilitated by volunteers and gatekeepers, named such because they hold the barriers, or they held the barriers at the four corners of the intersection, and they welcome people to the square. There's been limited police presence at the intersection over the past 15 months. Of course, this is complicated and contested. Questions that continue to be raised about increased crime in the area are serious, and they were named as the primary motivation by the city to, quote, end the protest, while many had asked that the effort to open the square be delayed until the trials of the 3 remaining former officers concluded. This, like many things in community, though, is not a universally held opinion, and some are frustrated with the continued disruption to traffic patterns and the limited access to business in the square prompted by the protest. The city worried about the barriers that were originally put in place by the city to protect the thousands of mourners and protesters who came to visit the intersection immediately after Mr. Floyd was killed. They worried about the disruption to businesses and ongoing life in the significant intersection in South Minneapolis. Bus routes have been interrupted, traffic has been detoured. It challenges access for city and emergency services. No one denies that. But that is also why there was the effort before sunrise to remove those barriers and to reopen the intersection. However, the city seemed completely unaware of what George Floyd Square has become and the importance of this space to the city. 38th and Chicago is actually the intersection of 4 neighborhoods: Central, Powderhorn, Bancroft, and Bryant. Each neighborhood association has been involved in the remaking and reimagining of George Floyd Square and the work to coordinate with the city. But it is the volunteers who are holding George Floyd Square as a site of protest, who are working to push city leadership to think through what the intersection has been, is now, and should be in the future. It is bizarre and simultaneously inspiring to see a space of so much disruption, violence, and pain transformed into a place of healing, where community is deeply felt and practiced. After living in the space, I've been thinking about the place of higher education community engagement in this particular moment. I am profoundly aware of how much my proximity to 38th and Chicago is informing my perspective on these ideas. At the same time, recognizing the pervasiveness of these issues, recognizing them as pandemics, I know that mine is not the only community experiencing this level of trauma and navigating this opportunity for healing. I can think now of the violence outside of Atlanta and across the country targeting Asians and Asian Americans, of the mass shootings we witnessed in Boulder, Colorado, Orange, California, and San Jose, the recent disasters of Hurricane Ida on the Gulf Coast, the wildfires in the West Coast, the oil spill in Southern California, even the insurrection attempt at the Capitol in January. All of these are sites of violence and trauma that have reverberating effects in our communities, especially when seeking to reconcile them against COVID and the expanding economic inequalities and disparate health impacts we continue to navigate. What do these intersections, both the physical location of 38th and Chicago, but also the intersection of the pandemics, of racism, of economic inequality, and of COVID-19, what do these intersections teach us about the possibility to create community and engage differently? In a 2020 article by TJ Stewart, issuing a Black feminist critique of higher education's response to COVID, he wrote, quote, "Black feminism at its core is a liberation framework, an emancipatory ethic, and as such instructs that we should all strive to change the material conditions of the marginalized, especially the hyper-marginalized, both in the academy and beyond." So what would Black feminism suggest for community engagement in higher education now? This attention to the hyper-marginalized requires focus on people and communities of color. It means naming the disproportionate impacts of these multiple pandemics on minoritized and hyper-marginalized communities and focusing our efforts on transforming the material conditions that sustain these inequalities. Our community engagement work should be revealing. It should make clear the systemic injustices at play that marginalize the already marginalized. Focus in on the policies, practices, conditions, and experiences that shape the everyday realities of the poor and of people of color. Community engaged work should find ordinary and creative ways to center those stories so that they are seen and heard and understood in new ways. At George Floyd Square, this work of revealing is emerging through the work of art and artists' statements that accompany them, through a clothesline where statistics wave beside personal testimonies from people in the community, through information signs at each station that explains why their presence is useful, important, and or necessary to the community members who are here. It is present in the reports to city leaders advocating for official recognition of the intersection as a city park, and the grant applications seeking funding to continue the development work in the neighborhood that neighborhood volunteers have shepherded and sustained. Shifting our community engagement practice in the wake of pandemics and in ways reflected in the efforts at George Floyd Square means building and maintaining relationships with BIPOC-led organizations, where those folks working and living in the communities where their work is centered. At George Floyd Square, George Floyd Square has shown that those organizations don't always need to be formally recognized as 501c3s, but that passionate and committed leaders who understand the unique and diverse needs of our community can be effective partners in this work. Our work needs to better match the priorities of the community members we purport to serve. And in order to do that, we need to hear what those community members are seeking in order to move closer to their own liberation. T.J. Stewart wrote, quote, "The impact of oppression on minoritized people is violent, magnified depending on the number of minoritized identities you have, and informs the context that you exist in. Too often, our actions in community are dictated by organizations in place for generations, but with little staff or investment from the community. It is work done for or done to, instead of work done with or done by. Our community engaged work should be responsive. Black feminism insists on taking the space and opportunity for those most impacted, in this case, Black women, to build a politics responsive to their lives and experiences that will remake the everyday, change lives, and ultimately bring forth the end of their oppression. At George Floyd Square, a weekly community needs assessment drives the work that happens at the intersection. Volunteers regularly engage visitors to the site to best understand what brings them to the memorial, and organizers host meetings with residents to learn what resources would facilitate the improvements they seek for themselves and for their community. Answers to these questions drive the partners invited to host space at George Floyd Square. The needs of the community and of the square get named twice daily at community meetings. They inform the 24 demands that George Floyd Square caretakers have assembled and named Justice Resolution 001. And they also drive the work of the day, but also future programming and development opportunities. They facilitate calls to council leaders, to treatment centers, to medical facilities, and others that can provide remediation for the concerns brought to the attention of organizers. George Floyd Square prioritizes those who live in direct proximity to the intersection. It cares about sustaining and creating the conditions for a thriving Black community that has often been disregarded. That doesn't mean that people engaged in the work of holding space and demanding justice are all Black. What it means is that everyone involved in the work of holding space and demanding justice are listening to Black people to most fully understand and determine what that means. It is wakefulness as consciousness, what Sharp calls, quote unquote, wake work, striving to move us closer to the unfinished project of emancipation. Our community engagement work should seek to repair. The past year and a half has revealed much about the costs of oppression in our society, the losses, the struggle, the precarity faced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color is represented by what Brian Stevenson names as, quote, the persistent refusal to view Black people as equals, end quote. By shaping our community engaged work as reparative, I am hopeful that we embody a praxis that challenges the skepticism in the possibility of community. We demonstrate our care by prioritizing the work that community names as necessary, and by sustaining our efforts in community until the emancipatory aims are met. We frame concerns as, quote, policy failures rather than personal failures in order to work towards system-level responses that may generate needed change. Andre Perry, for example, focuses on questions of the racial wealth gap and looks at practices that undervalue homes owned by people of color as contributors to the discrepancy we see between Black and white wealth in the US. Gloria Ladson Billings famously reframed the meanings of success and the discrepancy between persistence and school readiness for white students and students of color as an opportunity debt rather than an achievement gap. These reframings, but also the work in communities that these kinds of understandings require, move us toward a reparative community engagement praxis. Santiago Ortiz encourages us to embrace epistemic disobedience. Epistemic disobedience, and anti-colonial engagements that disrupt hierarchies and prioritize solidarity, quote, working for transformation collectively and interdependently. At George Floyd Square, the focus on healing feels reparative. The work to honor George Floyd's life while advancing calls for police reform, for affordable housing, and investment in business opportunities for people of color feels reparative. Lead caretaker Janelle Austin warns against, quote, letting pain be our primary source of energy, end quote, and instead prioritizes joy. The centering of art, the centering of beauty, the centering of fun and laughter aim to leverage the capacity for joy, recognizing that joy can be its own form of protest and resistance. The collective organizing and shared labor that guides the work at the memorial site reflects the kind of community leadership envisioned by civil rights activist Ella Baker. I appreciate Grace Lee Boggs theorizing that hyper-local focused action, like this one intersection in South Minneapolis, can become spaces to practice the just societies we hope to create. It reminds me of the opportunity that is present, as Sharp contends, for people who are aware of and conscious of their being in the wake, that it, quote, avails us of particular ways of re-seeing, re-inhabiting, and reimagining the world, end quote. I remain hopeful that we move beyond practice to a sustained reality of radical change rooted in justice. And while I think the way forward for our community engaged practice can be guided by this framework of reveal, respond, and repair, I realize that this example of George Floyd Square is not one that represents or partners with higher education community engagement. I know some of us from my own institution, the University of Minnesota, as well as other local colleges, are involved in different ways at the intersection, but none of it is formalized community engagement work in the sense that most of us in higher education typically recognize it. The work to remake and reimagine the community requires hands-on effort and active participation at the site. People are sweeping. People are collecting money to support the ongoing effort. Donated items for mutual aid, the works of art, the letters to the Floyd family, the offerings that are brought to the square to honor George Floyd. All of these need to be cataloged and organized, and people are distributing these items to community members in need. They're distributing information about the justice demands for a thriving 38th Street corridor. They're giving directions to the various installations in the square, and people are painting new art, they're covering graffiti, they're beautifying the square. People are greeting literally dozens and sometimes hundreds of visitors daily, and even hosting media as curiosity about and interest in George Floyd Square persists. All of these activities are about honoring the freedom dreams, as Robin Kelly calls it, and the hopes for justice that bring people to George Floyd Square. It is about inspiring the possibilities for greater justice and bringing us closer to realizing it. Janelle Austin insists that, quote, building stronger communities is rooted in the decision we make to be a neighbor, end quote. What does it mean to recenter the focus of partnership from nonprofits to neighbors, and to move this work to spaces of mutual aid and community building where needs and work shifts day to day, where the consistent activity that so typically guides community engagement placements in higher education is left flexible and unpredictable? How is higher education community engagement transformed when we see ourselves and the institutions we work with as our neighbors? How do our decisions shift? How does our work change when we position our work with the desire to be good neighbors who build good relationships with the people in the communities where we are? Mariam Kaba, a prison abolition activist who wrote a book in 2021 titled "We Do This Till We Free Us," asks, quote, when something cannot be fixed, the question is, what do we do instead? End quote. George Floyd Square to me is the instead. It embodies organizing. It recognizes immediate need and long-term hope. It engages our neighbors. It inspires joy. It knows that a different future is necessary and believes that a different future is possible. It reflects the wake work that Sharp reminds us is necessary to bringing forward new consciousness. I'm eager to think through and think about what opportunities higher education has and the opportunities higher education is willing to take to reveal, to respond, and to repair the disparate impacts of COVID-19, of structural racism, and of economic inequality. I'm curious to see if the commitments made by so many institution leaders in the wake of George Floyd's death actually result in actions of accountability for the ways institutions of higher education have been implicated in and contributors to the ongoing harms of structural racism. I'm conscious of being in the wake of multiple pandemics. And I want to use that consciousness awakened by this moment to do the wake work that Sharp encourages, to quote, imagine otherwise from what we know now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell. Wow. I think we're all still processing all of the things that you addressed. A very, very powerful presentation. I know we typically open up for questions, and certainly if anyone would like to go ahead and put a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask the question directly of Dr. Mitchell. I have a feeling a lot of folks are still really thinking about what you just said, but again, please feel free. Think about a question. I see Pia just said, wow, is correct. So much information to process. Yes. I think one of the things that I was, that I'll get sort of start things off with is just the idea, as you're saying, to think of communities as our neighbors. How do we work with our neighbors? And I think that is something that we have not really done in higher education. And again, I'm coming at this from a community college perspective, but I don't think that most faculty think of our surrounding community in a sense of neighbors. We think of it as the businesses, we think about the nonprofits and things like that, but we don't think, as you're saying, as neighbors. What would you say, Dr. Mitchell, as far as advice, if we as a group could take one thing away and say, let's take it back to our campus, how do we start to change that kind of mindset? Because I think that's really so much of what you're talking about, that this is a change. This is not just something you go out and do, but it is it's a paradigm shift in many ways. And I'm just wondering, what might be that one thing that we could do to kind of start that shift moving on our campuses?
That's such a great question. Thank you, Patty, for it. It's hard to say and hard to know, in part because the thing that made the shift for me was a man dying 3 blocks from my home, right? And it shouldn't require that level of violence, that level of trauma to get us to recognize that we as representatives of higher education institutions are members of a community, that we are neighbors, and that our institution is a neighbor in the space. I live 3 blocks from 38th in Chicago. The University of Minnesota is 4 miles from 38th in Chicago. So it's not this tremendous distance between where I work, where I live, in the space. I'm sorry, y'all, I have no control over the lights in my office. So I apologize that I keep going dark. But there is the one of the things that has helped me in shifting mindsets has been conversations with my neighbors, particularly my neighbors who I know access many of the resources that I've often engaged my students with in community engagement, right? One of the things that I have long complained about in community engagement spaces is that as faculty, we rarely engage with the community organizations that we ask our students to participate in. I've been to so many colleges and universities and found that faculty members would say, oh, my students do work here, 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 and here. And then I'll ask them how much time they've spent in those spaces, and they've never been. They rely heavily on the institutional structures of either the nonprofit organization itself or the university that may manage or support community engagement work to build those relationships for them in the community. And when you rely on those structures, you don't have a relationship. It's really difficult to understand fully what is happening in our communities if you're not in community. And so one of the biggest difference makers for me has been making effort to actually build relationships with my neighbors, particularly those who access services where my students may be placed or partnered with, if I'm working with a nonprofit organization, of doing the work of showing up at community meetings, at community sites, at events, and learning more about what is happening in the everyday, so that I can be as responsive a participant as possible, and see myself as not only invested in what's happening there, but truly impacted by it, right? That that recognizing that the work that we're doing to support our neighbors, to work on development initiatives, to provide resources and services and access to opportunities that work towards more just futures, not only has a direct impact on, hopefully a direct impact on the people that I'm working with in the everyday, but on me too, on the space where I live, on the neighborhood that I'm involved in, and what the opportunities are for this community that I've chosen to live in.
And I would just respond, I think what you said is so spot on, that we have so many folks that they don't really have a good sense of what is happening right in the community. Literally, you walk outside from your campus and not having that kind of connection. So I love that idea of the neighbors. Elaine, I see your hand is up.
Yes. Well, Patty, you actually asked my first question, but I have a second question. Hi, Tania. I guess, Tania, if you can share a little reflections on conversations with your students over the past year and how you integrated this into the courses, especially since you were having to teach online. Anyway, just any reflections and lessons learned that maybe folks here as faculty could also learn from.
I thank you for that question, Elaine. I'm going to answer that in just a second, but I also wanted to add my additional caveat with regard to the institutional privilege. And I said wake work, Pia. But wake folk can work too in that way. But the other thing I'm recognizing is that there are also structures and systems in our own institutions that sometimes can make that relationship to our neighborhoods impossible, right? Like how many folks who, just by virtue of the cost of housing in their neighborhoods and communities, don't get the opportunity to live in close proximity to where they work. And so I want to acknowledge that there are other institutional and economic and structural barriers that may impact all of us. And being able to take advantage, and being able to be in proximity to the communities where we're working. So I just want to name that really quick. But Elaine, to your question, I was a little bit off the hook last year because I was on sabbatical. So I wasn't teaching while all this was happening, which was the biggest gift, I spent a lot of time on my sabbatical, like really lamenting all of the things that I had imagined that I was going to do that I didn't get to do, because I didn't have the opportunity to travel the way that I had intended. But what it meant was that I had the freedom to spend a lot of time in George Floyd Square. And so the spending time there in the community, attending the meetings, participating in mutual aid distribution, getting to meet the Floyd family and caretakers, and to really understand what the space means, what the square means for people in my community and outside of it. Even getting to understand what it means from those who really hate really hate that this protest has been ongoing because it's forced their business to close. That if you noticed in my slides, you saw a picture of the People's Way. That used to be our gas station. It has been taken over and is now decommissioned, which means that now where the closest gas station is now 3 miles away, which 3 miles isn't a lot, except when you have no gas in your car. And so those kinds of disruptions to spaces, people who have lost businesses, people who feel like they just want things to get back to normal. It is, when I say that it's contested space, I'm not lying. Like that work to remove the barricades and barriers was actually supported by members of our very own neighborhood. And so we had neighbors versus neighbors coming out to really try to distract and disrupt those efforts to dismantle the square, to allow traffic through. And we're still working on trying to build those relationships in order to make it a space where everyone in the community feels like it is representative of what happened and also of what we need in order to be a productive community in terms of economics and all of the other the access issues and all of the other pieces that would help people feel safer. Because I've been able to spend so much time there over the last year, when I went back into the classroom this year, it has been a real opportunity. There's so many, this semester I'm teaching organizational leadership. And so this has been just the most perfect case study, right? In terms of being able to make connections between what is happening at the square and the theories with regard to organizational leadership that we're studying. And so we can look at these different efforts in terms of the city government and the community, the neighborhoods that are intersecting in those organizations, and the individual residents who are involved in multiple and different ways in terms of their efforts to either hold the square or to advocate for its reopening. And thinking about the different motivations, the different contestations that have shaped those experiences, that's been very powerful. It has created the really powerful space to again, really interrogate the ongoing impacts of racism and of economic inequality and disparities, and how those have been hyper-focused in this one community that led it to even be a place where someone passes a $20 counterfeit bill and ends up dead, right? And so it has, it's become a really important case study. I have not chosen, mostly because of the our institution's sort of continued restrictions and cautions around COVID. I've not chosen to engage my students in the square as a formal part of the class, but they know its case, they know my proximity to it. They all have opportunity to go and be there if they choose, but I have not made it a formal part of the community engagement experience.
I want to move on to Pia's question, but before I do that, and again, thank you, Elaine, for your question. Kimberly had put something just for us to kind of think about, which I think is very good because many of us were involved last week with Tim Eatman's presentation, and really thinking in terms of what kind of higher education institution does our democracy need. I mean, Tim really made us start thinking about this, and today's presentation is overlapping so much with a lot of the things that he started to introduce us to. And then obviously with Dr. Mitchell, she's living the experience and how she is relating this to us. But I want to move to Pia's question, and Pia asked, what can we do to make this so much more influential and important, and to make change that stays at the top of our society's point of view? We should not have to always make the extreme and negative the only moving action. Why not positive and good also? So it's kind of a bit of a compound, and it's sort of different questions and thoughts there, but I think what Pia is really getting at, and Pia, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask the question directly.
Yes, I just want to say that, it seems that the only time we ever get any reaction is when there's something that hits home negatively, right? And it seems like to make this part of our future permanently, how can we take not only these negative experiences, but take the counter experience of something that we can promote so that people will get involved and make this change without even realizing, like without even being stressed about doing it. Like if we present something to them in a positive way that is not, in other words, our situation is, the reason this occurred is because there's already so much negativity floating around this whole issue, and it's been there, and it's systemic, and it's the way things have always been, right? And so if we could present it in a way that say, hey, you know what? Here's something that happened that we really need to honor. And we want to do it by making a green space here, and then taking that around the nation, that thought, not that incident, because that applies only to the place where it occurs. In so many ways, it only affects the people that are right there that are occurred. Even though people say, oh, I saw it on the news, it's really horrible, because it's not in their backyard. They don't really feel that they have to react. But if we could get the reaction of it going in a positive manner to everybody, and take that and spread it around, it would be so much easier to get our cities and our societies and our communities of everyone, the business community, the school community, everybody, our political communities, to become more joined together to make things happen that are promoting the downfall of this systemic racism and everything else.
I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the work of the caretakers at George Floyd Square to, leverage our capacity for joy, right?
Yes.
Like the, to see 100 people roller skating in the middle of this intersection, traveling, in a circle. We made the area around, it's now considered a traffic roundabout, although
Right.
no one can actually go around it, which is why traffic is limited in the square. It's not wide enough for buses and large vehicles. They often get stuck there when they attempt. We basically extended that space around the fist sculpture and made it into an ice rink, and then in the winter and then in the spring made it into a roller skating rink. And to see 100 people, skating around, you saw the picture that I included of the bubble party that we had one afternoon, right? The thing that the caretakers at George Floyd Square are aspiring to do is to create a pocket, right? A pocket of the just community that we imagine in the world. And so all of these things are serving to remind us Absolutely, right? To remind us, to make clear and transparent, like what happened here that day and what continues to happen here that makes life hard for people who live in the 38th Street corridor. And
Right.
simultaneously, right? And simultaneously to remind us that that is not all that happens here. This space is not
Right.
just one of destruction. It is not just one of disturbance. It is not just one of violence. It is one where children live and thrive. And we are doing everything we can to make sure that everyone in our neighborhood and our community thrives. And so that has to be a part of our messaging as the protest is sustained, as we advocate for the square to become a permanent memorial, that it is as much a memorial as it is a community building space.
Exactly.
It is as much a challenge to our city to recognize the ongoing impacts and harms in this one neighborhood as it is an opportunity to remake and reimagine a future 38th Street corridor that is stronger and better and richer in all of its ways, both economic and in terms of human capital and capacity, as it can be. And so that's the message. It is one that is complicated, right? Because
Yeah.
what the city wants is, and the ways that we've all been taught, right, that economic development happens, that community development happens, is that you make room and space for businesses, which means that cars need to be able to get through there, which means we need to do more building, which means we need to we need new things, as opposed to investing in what is already there. And so, and we see in other spaces, George Floyd's death in Minneapolis was obviously the most public and most sustained in terms of media coverage of this kind of state violence, right? But we saw, right, the week before Derek Chauvin's trial began, we had another young man who was killed by a police officer, Dante Wright. And in the weeks following Derek Chauvin's conviction, we had another man, Winston Smith, who was killed by police violence. And efforts to hold space in those locations were immediately shut down by the city, right? There was like, we are not doing George Floyd Square 2.0 in these other communities. Like, we're not going to let it happen. And so there is, this, there is a lens that shapes how people see sites of protest, right? And sites of protest are often coded as negative, as harmful, as dangerous. And our efforts ongoing are always to shift that narrative,
Thank you, Tanya. And like you say, did the city pay anything for the George Foreman Square? Did they do anything specifically?
The city's investment in the square has primarily been, it was initially in the barricades, and then obviously, so there was labor involved in the establishment of the barricades, and then there was additional city labor involved in the removal of the barricades. There are intentions in the budgeting process for 2021 to invest in the neighborhoods, particularly in the business corridor of 38th Street, that is supposed to bring more resources into the community. But there's a significant set of demands. What I named in my talk is Justice Resolution 001. I will try to find it and put that link in the chat for you. But there are a specific set of demands that the caretakers of George Floyd Square have made, that the city is barely engaging with, is what I will say, in terms of what that means.
What you've just said makes, I'm sorry to take so much time, but just one more point. What you've just said makes me think that this roundabout that's been created, I mean, there's lots of places you can use a roundabout and not stop business, right? It increases business. Like, so if the city were to say, okay, well, we'll keep the roundabout and we'll just pay for it to be expanded, and then you can use it on certain days, every day, in this day in the summer and this day in these days in the winter, and that way we'll close it for the roller rink and the fun, and close it for the ice rink and the fun. But then during the times that people aren't skating, we can use it to still increase access to the neighborhood and the businesses. You know, we could put a barrier around the outside edge that provides spaces for all those businesses in the area to have reading spaces for bookstores, or um, dining spaces for restaurants, and places, coffee places for people to sit, like a palazza. You know, that's the part of the positive that may get people more involved in more contribution. That's the part I would want to work on, to try and spread that concept all over everywhere. Not just because it's more positive, but because it's just expanding on what really needs to be recognized in my mind. You know, it needs to be recognized that these things aren't available equally. They don't provide equity. And that's one of the things we need to do, is increase the equity for everyone.
So with that, I know we are a little over time, and I know we had one last question, but for the sake of time, and I know Dr. Mitchell, you have been so gracious to stay and answer questions, and we appreciate that greatly. And I don't want to take any more of your time, but I just want to say thank you so very, very much. This has been an amazing presentation. Again, so much to think about. And again, just a real honor to have you here today.